So maybe if
And
you can share what is lean inception in high level summary for people who are not aware of it.
sure, Inception, in high level, you need to align a group of people to be successful. That's it. It's about alignment. You usually go to a company, corporation, or a product. It doesn't matter. There is a vision. Hey, that's amazing. That's a vision. Woohoo, we're all going to be rich. We're going to be successful. Yeah, and then what? And then you need to align. Is this strategy? Like, what's the path? Traditionally, we would go with the strategy and it's like a long train wreck. Oh, we need to do this and this and that and that. We realize the world's not like that. So on the Inception, align that group of people. Okay, what is the vision? And then we try to align what is the MVP, the minimum viable product. So we're okay with the vision. It's important to have the vision, but what's that very first step? It's very hard to align about that very first step. Because when you think about a minimum viable product, you need to think about it from three angles. The business angle, which is super important, the business behind it. It doesn't matter if you're a small company or a big company, it's a business. The users, because you always build something for someone to use and like you want the users to love it. And then the engineers, because you need to build it, right? When you put those three people together to figure out what is that minimum, it's not that easy because each one has different perspective and they want different things. So Inception about it, getting those three perspectives together so they align and decide, okay, what is that very first step?
And you mentioned it's also an evolution since it was created before, right? Like you mentioned the portion of the lean, so it becomes lean inception. So how do you actually combine this lean startup movement with this inception? And how does this relate to design thinking? To me, it sounds a little bit similar.
Yeah, no, it definitely has a lot of influence from design thinking, right? You have to put this in perspective. I was in US from 2000 to 2008. So I was there in the beginning of the agile movement. So I'm highly influenced by the agile movement, but I was a developer. So I had the pain of, oh, this project's not successful because like, hey, I built something and no one's using it. This is from 2000 to 2008. Before that, on the 90s, I was an object-oriented person. So I like object-oriented analysis, design, implementation, all that thing that used to have like years ago. But from that, there was something interesting because we used to have inception phase. In fact, Rational created UML. Another thing they created was the Rational Unified Process, which was agile. Like the industry was moving towards where to be more agile. And Rupa was one of those first methodologies that showed up. Today, you look at it like, oh, it was so slow, but at the time it's fast. And then they named that beginning of the understanding of what we need to do on a project as inception. So when I went to US and we start with the agile movement, now we start doing more like of agile inceptions where we understand everything we need to do for that project. We used to use the word project. You would map it to user stories. For example, like another colleague of ours, Jeff Patton, he wrote the book User Story Mapping. That's from that period where we try to understand everything, the users, their journey, the business needs, and we map everything to user stories and we do this huge release planning with all the sprints. So sprint 1, 2, 3. You even estimate everything and you have story points and you have burn up for, oh, we're going to deliver 300 story points and you have that release plan for 1 year. And nowadays, looking back, I'm like, wow, I was crazy to do that. Why I'm saying this? Because like in 2011, they startup movement in Silicon Valley. They're like, hey, I don't care about doing agile or not. We cannot build a product for 1 year to see if it makes sense to the user. Let's do something, the minimum thing we can do to validate if you're going in a good direction. And that's the MVP. So the Leanception is a shift from let me understand the overall project to, yeah, let's talk about the vision and then figure out how do we get started. So the focus is not more on release planning of all the user stories. The focus is like, okay, how do we start? When you talk about MVP, now the focus not that much on where all the user stories behind it. It's more like, where are you validating? What hypothesis are you validating? Let's talk about the business, the user experience, and then the engineer side. What is the minimum we can do to validate you're going in a good direction? Of course, after the Inception, if you're a software delivery team, you break it into user story. But now it became much easier because it's much smaller and everybody's aligned. So that's the shift on Inception. It's like bringing that lean startup thinking as a center outcome, like a center result of that alignment. And of course, as I'm doing Inception in 2011, design thinking as a movement is something that was getting more and more popular as well. I myself am a really good facilitator. Besides being a software engineer that like process and improvement, I'm a really good facilitator. So I brought all of my facilitation skills on how to align a group of people from different perspectives. You need a lot of skills like handling post-its, the cluster, and do a fishbowl, all this kind of stuff. The book has two sides. One's like, hey, let's talk about MVP. It's very important. We should focus on it. The sequence of activities, they work really well. So if you want to figure out, okay, how to align a group of people and do the MVP, you can do like I did. It took me like 4 or 5 years to figure out a good sequence of activities that went well. And I was running Inception like almost every week. Or you follow that recipe that you're going to figure out, wow, if I follow this, we achieve great results at the end. So that's the Inception, the mix of the activities and the sequence and why MVP with some tips and notes on how do you facilitate it.
How about the design thinking? Because design thinking, I mean, we also have this sprint design, right? Sounds like it's also a similar time frame where you envision what you want to build and you have an MVP at the end of it. So what's the difference here?
Design sprint and Inception, right? I find it fascinating. Jake Knapp, he was also in Silicon Valley, right? I think he's a little younger than me. I was more of a developer. He was more of a designer. You have a difference there. But he was living in Silicon Valley. We went through similar companies. He was feeling the same pain that I was feeling. It's like, damn it, I need to align these people to figure out what they're going to do. Even as a coincidence, I was a consultant at Google for 1 year, same time that he was there as well. We almost worked on the same thing. It was very interesting. I even remember him from there. Of course, like both of us were not famous, but like I remember, oh, there's this design dude, which I like his style. Like I could see he's a good facilitator. Google is huge, so we went on different teams. What happened is, in common, both of us use design thinking. Post-its and, okay, how to align people. The double diamond, open the options, and then you close some options. Both of us have that same style. Both of us came to the conclusion that, like, you know what? It is a week. It is a 5-day thing. I had time. Sometimes I would make it, or sometimes I would make it shorter. If it is shorter, you don't have time to have a brainstorming. It's more like if you try to do something in design sprint or Inception in 1 day, probably someone telling you that's what I want to go figure out. If you have in a week, you can open the options and then make a decision and close it at the end. The thing is, like, from the time I was working on Google, I went to India and I was running Inception for UK, and then I went to Brazil. So I was not following what he was doing, and he was not following what I was doing, especially that I was writing a lot in Portuguese. And we came to a lot of similarities based on practical experience. But the place where we diverge, where we do difference, and of course this has to do with our backgrounds, he has that week about the design team. So he is more focused on the design. So get that people that will figure out the design. They'll have some options for the design. They'll put in front of users. He's going to get like 5 users, for example. They will test, and then they'll decide, okay, we have one winning prototype, but it's based on a design, on an interface. At the end result, it's a prototype. He comes from the design world. I come from the startup. I come from Agile, where we used to have the user story that tells you exactly what's the value it's going to bring, how I'm going to implement, and sometimes even has the interface. I don't want that as an MVP. As an MVP, I want to be very clear, what do I want to validate? But I don't want to specify the how. So it's a big difference to know if at the end of the week you have a prototype, and use the prototype for something bigger. That's design sprint. On the Inception, you align a group of people about the vision, and you have a plan for the MVP. But you do not have a prototype. Use the prototype for something bigger. MVP is a plan for something small, that first step. That's a major difference. It's a strategic difference. If you think you know where you're going to know the big picture, if you're already aligned about what you want, design sprint. If you want to align about what do you want, how do you start, Inception. Or you combine both and then it's amazing.